Just some highlights from his notes. He talks about, of course, trying to create this the real Anna, and actually those last lines that she utters are considered the last words she actually said. But I felt his strongest line was that the story depicts our community's recurring fear of the different. Thanks to this phenomenon, its heroine, while actually a healing force towards her surroundings, was considered a threat, and the authorities attempted to suppress her luminous presence. And he really was trying to stand up against that with this film. And actually made this film because he feels this actually still exists and is very much relevant today, even though this takes place in the past. The film was extremely successful in Finland and was one of the box office successes of that year. Anyway, I will now get some reflections from Jonah.
First of all, thanks so much everybody for coming out tonight and for sticking around this late in the evening. I'm really glad to hear some of the words from the director, because as I was watching that film, I was certainly thinking a lot about its contemporary relevance to some of the way things are today. I think on the heels of the era depicted in this film, the anti-psychiatry movement arose in response in a lot of ways to much of the violence and just egregious oppression that we saw depicted tonight. We saw some nuance in the film. I think there was definitely ambivalence on the part of some of the authorities there in terms of what they were doing and how, but in many ways the tendency to look for an instant technological outside cure to difference is still runs really deep through the institutions that continue to manage a lot of these conditions. So I'm going to say a little bit about some of the work that I've been involved in and kind of what brought me to the film tonight, and then I'd love to open up the conversation to people's reactions, because I know it was a very visceral visual film. As I was explaining, historically there was a movement that arose in response to a lot of what we saw tonight, and I think the direct descendants of that movement today are still struggling against what has become an even more nuanced type of oppression, although I think visually a lot of that was captured in the swaddling that we saw early on in the scene, and just as far as wrapping these people up in blankets, and nowadays there's a movement that's growing in strength daily. It's the Mad Pride movement. I think we've had a presence thanks to the organizers here as part of the Disabilities Film Festival for the past few years. And a lot of what the movement is about is trying to redefine the language that's often used to describe mental illness, reinventing languages of compassion and safer spaces for people to share their subjective narratives in and around their experiences, and really try to live the mantra of the disability rights movement: nothing about us without us. And to some degree, that remains one of the most radical propositions I think that you can find out there nowadays. Unlike the anti-psychiatry movement, things have moved beyond dogmatic, black and white resistance to psychiatry, medication, and labeling in any and all of its forms, but crucially the importance of developing this kind of language of compassion and participating in the judgments and decisions in and around normalcy and difference, and most importantly, I think recognizing people's humanity. As depicted in this film, I think trauma ran deep through most people's stories, and the dysfunction and disability across many of the medical authorities was also depicted, I think really well. So that's a little bit more about some of the work that I do as an activist. My research also takes up a lot of corruption in psychiatry and pharma, and that's a little more technocratic, but I'm happy to talk about some of that as well. But maybe before I continue, we can hear from some folks about some of their initial reactions and maybe what brought them here tonight.
Go ahead. Go ahead,
Barbara. Just briefly, as a psychologist and part of quite a large international group that objects to the phrase mental illness. And the biggest fault of the film to me is that although it's a beautifully made film and what a wonderful spirit, Finland happens to be now one of the leading countries in something called open dialogue, where these big hospitals are now empty. The only people in them are the older people who didn't have this treatment, who don't have this open dialogue treatment now, because people with so-called schizophrenia can now be cured and without the medications that they were implying were replacing lobotomies.
I think there's actually a lot going on in Finland that is incredibly innovative on that front. I would like to stress that this film is not quite as ancient as it might look. There's been a tremendous resurgence in electroshock therapy. It's made a ridiculous comeback, and believe it or not, lobotomies have been reintroduced as well. Yeah, and some rare exceptions, but the electroshock is it happens here in New York State. Even in some circumstances, as a forced measure, the modern day atypical antipsychotics, which were touted much like the drugs that were introduced at the end of this film as a cure-all that eliminated all the side effects, turn out to actually cause diabetes, are incredibly toxic, and are being pushed aggressively on everyone from children with behavioral disorders to old people with dementia. So the themes that are brought up in this film are incredibly current, and it's true. I think this film actually never left the hospital, never really used diagnoses except in the subtitles. I don't know finish, but I'm not sure how that may or may not have translated. But the notion that people are sick, there is no cure, and they need to be treated for the rest of their lives is still one that is being promoted aggressively by the pharmaceutical industry.
I'll just share the exact words from the director as far as his connection to what's going on today in Finland. He says, although the story unfolds in the past, its subject is still topical today, where the separation between social classes is growing, the cuts in healthcare and the increasing number of outpatients are a disturbing reality, and genetic manipulation looms on the horizon. Difference is still very much a source of fear for our society.
Jonah, I'm wondering if, assuming that the depiction of her condition was reasonably accurate, she was delusional and did have all these delusions of loyalty and so forth, how today would a person with a similar syndrome be treated according to the principles of that you're enunciating here?
How would they be treated, or how would we like for them to be treated?
No, how would you like them to be treated?
So, yeah, I mean, I think what's depicted in this film, first of all, this belongs to a family of films. There's certainly shades of Walter Cuckoo's Nest, 12 Monkeys, there's yes, of course. There's a lot of films in this genre. I think this one, has some unique contributions to make, and it was particularly graphic, if you ask me. Nowadays, I think in many circumstances, people are locked up often against their will when they're a threat to themselves or to others. But it's a little bit of a sleight of hand because they might not be released until they conform to a standard of normalcy. I mean, but beyond that, even as they're released, they're not entirely free, depending on the treatment regimen that they're inflicted with. I mean, it's right, that they're prescribed. Sure. There's also, of course, constraints that society imposes, and those start with stigma, but I think stigma is also a very complex topic, insofar as I think there's a lot of ways in which stigma or the efforts to remove stigma are bundled with the notion of accepting a certain paradigm. And so, you know, if mental illness is a stigma, then the campaigns to remove that stigma often include accepting the illness, that you are ill for life, that there is no cure, and you need to be medicated for the rest of your life. And so it's conceivable that some of these treatments ought to be stigmatized, should lobotomies be stigmatized. So in response to your question in terms of how people ought to be treated, I think it is important, imperative, difficult for us to learn to approach people on their own terms. I think, you know, this, what we witnessed tonight, I guess, you know, the characters varied, and there were some severe crises in play, although I think there was a decided neglect of the conditions that, you know, clearly, you know, were factors in people's responses to a very unjust and cruel world. I think there were few attempts while Prince Henry was accepting of the delusion. I don't think he really explored issues around abandonment and you know, some of the complexities that generated or might have given rise to, you know, or took it more seriously at the psychological front. And of course, Christina, I think, had was dealing with a lot of serious issues as well. So I think, you know, the hard part is thinking through how to incorporate people's own narratives and ways of thinking of themselves and help support them in working through their own traumas.
So, but try to be more specific, Jonah. Would you recommend, I know you're not a psychiatrist, but according to the model that you conceived, would she be hospitalized in some way? Or would she be treated with medication? Or were her delusions, which were pretty harmless really, she wasn't hurting anyone, and she clearly was helping some people, and she wasn't hurting herself, would it be appropriate just to somehow live with all those delusions and not really treat it as an illness?
Certainly difficult to make any kind of judgment like that based on an hour-and-a-half film. I think right now we certainly don't have all of the support systems in place to really treat people. I think actually, if I'm not mistaken, in Finland they are experimenting with some approaches that go beyond that, and there have been experiments in the past. Before watching this film, just reading the blurb, I was absolutely reminded of the scene in 12 Monkeys where the person believed that he was from the other planet. I don't know if people remember the quote or not, and you know that even though his reality was completely consistent and entirely harmless, and he did not embrace conceptual reality, they still treated him similarly. So I think there are very serious issues if we treat people who are actually harmless and not threatening themselves or others the way that people in this movie were treated.
I'm going to take 2 more questions.
I think one interesting point about the film is, you know, when we watch the picture of the psychiatrist, who in our minds is someone from yesteryear, you know, from a while back, it's easy to view him as the evil person that no longer exists. What's unfortunately sad is it's not limited to psychiatry or mental health. I think in many ways the power we've given to physicians and the power which they've taken upon themselves of using the scientific method, which is beautiful in many ways, but very limited in its scope of acceptance and thinking outside the box. It's always a matter of getting, you know, published, moving ahead, getting recognition, and I think one of the powerful aspects of this film that we really should walk away from and recognize in today's day and age is to recognize our own ability to assess a situation and to recognize that just because someone wears a medical coat, that they do not hold all the answers, and they do not have the totality of the information of what's possible. I think what's very important is to be able to view a situation of, you know, what is really in the best interest of the person. You know, you bring this person back into reality, what does she have going on in this world? You know, so bringing her back to a sense of reality, what is that going to offer her? And I think one beautiful outcome of this festival and working with disabilities is disabilities forces the conversation of really what can we offer someone in terms of the best type of life within the situation that they have. And just one way of approaching the question that you had is like when we have Elaine Hall, you know, dealt with with working with an autistic person, it's working within that person's reality. And I think one of the ways that we are seeing today, I mean, I definitely have this advantage working with the developmentally disabled, is you allow them to express themselves. You allow them to have their realities, but at the same time, you offer them the boundaries of the world that they live in. And you try to invoke it only in the places that are necessary, where they are specifically a harm to themselves or others. But in ways that they can really express themselves and grow, you work within their paradigms, as well as offering them as much information as needed from the world around them. And while you're working with the individuals, you're equally working with the staff. You know, the staff walks in with these preconceived notions the way the world has to be. And as much as you're working with the clients to open them up and allow them to recognize how much power they really deserve, it's also a matter of making the staff comfortable enough to know that they have the ability to work with them on their level and to trust themselves and to trust that their managers are going to stand behind them and allow for an open society and open conversation. And you'll be shocked with the results we're seeing. It's really beautiful stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one question that made me think about or wonder is as whether or not this film is a comedy or a tragedy. Sure, she avoided the lobotomy, but 50 years later, she has spent her entire life in an institution. Did she need to? Was it just a matter that there wasn't enough social services or support at the time? And if we look across, pardon me?
They moved her out of the institution that she wanted to remain in, into the community, into the village that.
It was another institution. She was still in an institution. I don't think that was just a hospital.
The question is, could the institution sort of conform to being a new world?
Right. I mean, I was, taking it to questions of homeless and prisons and many of the underprivileged who are being treated this way. Right. To what? And so, but in any case, I think she was at an institution at the very end. Although, she was sad to leave the matter.
Changed by then anyway. I have a question. Is it me who just miss the point, or was it purposely subtle? Was he sleeping with the long-haired Baroness, and that's what the drawing with the baby and the supposedly the Baroness all about? And was that for sure, or was that just a hint? And am I just imagining that? And that coitus is the medical recommendation that she says a few times while they're on their little journey.
That the doctor was treating her with that.
Treating her in quotations.
Right. I can't say. We need it.
Anybody else have a way with that?
Yeah.
Okay, at least I'm not imagining it.
No, but I think that what she referenced about her father being a bad man is that she was a victim of incest.
Right, and he continued on. Continued that marriage.
That's really interesting.
Wow.
Thanks for that.
There is actually her art, by the way, is actually placed around the world in different places, and she's and one of the interpretations that I've heard of in general, her obsession with Mary and mother figures was, of course, referencing her own issues with her mother that definitely played out.
It was like a stab at him about what he may have been doing with the Baroness.
Right, a recognition of how much she realized from the world around her.
Yes. So it's not that he was doing anything to the
It's both.
Oh, it's both. Thank you. Okay, it's both. Thank you. Wow.
If I know what you're doing, I have to leg up on things like that.
After the conversation.
We're going to take one last comment right here.
I just was very confused by one thing I kept seeing. There were a number of characters here that were clearly self-injurious and clearly killed themselves, and there were repeated incidents in which they attempted to, yet there were these bizarre open balconies and these knives and people showing up with swords in the middle of nowhere. And for me, it looked completely unrealistic. However, was that allegorical, or was it just totally unrealistic? It's not. It doesn't make sense.
I couldn't say anything in particular about the conditions at the time, but certainly the attitude of experimentation and contradiction is accurate and still is. The notion that patients are being experimented on, where there's no solid prior knowledge. Scenes with the alcohol, for example, right? And so are in some ways even more preposterous than an open balcony. So I mean, they were living there forever. So it's not clear if they didn't really feature visitors or their families. There were
Swords, hatchets.
right, but in many ways there was very little context. I mean, we were kind of in a vacuum. We were in a world of delusion the entire film that had very little outside world. So it's hard to say, but it does make you wonder.
The only thing I could add on to that as far as the specifics is that she was famous, the balconies were famous there, and her singing from the balconies was something that was also a reality. And they show at the end, this is just one last point, they show at the end the statue monument that was placed on the grounds, and they say that is the only monument in the world that's been erected in the honor of a patient who spent years in that hospital. And the director writes that this is to remind us of how a small human being can heal their surroundings more effectively than the formula written in the healthcare system. The formula written in the healthcare system. I'd like to thank Jonah. Thank you all. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow night, closing night. And please give us your surveys. We really appreciate your feedback. Thank you.